Good afternoon and welcome. Can I first begin with apologizing? I can see that there are a lot of you waiting for this live stream, and I'm really sorry, but there was some problem with our live stream, which is why we've started 10 minutes late, which is the first time it's happened. But my apologies to all members of the audience, as well as to panelists who've had to wait for the last 10 minutes. A very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar, and I'm Deputy Director of the South Asia Centre here at the London School of Economics. I'm very happy to welcome you to this afternoon's event, which focuses on Bangladesh and Pakistan's relations, most recently over the last 12 to 14 months, where it has seen a new bounce in its step. The leaders of the two countries have met at two international events now. There have been high-level meetings between military personnel, foreign ministers, the signing of trade agreements, visa-free travel, and there are signs that this positive relationship is set to continue. Our event this afternoon will discuss the meaning as well as the impact of this newfound relationship between the two countries, not only for themselves, but also its impact on the wider region, that is South Asia, and perhaps wider if it comes into the discussion. But before I get into that, a very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us from different time zones across the world. I know from emails, etc., that there are people literally from across the globe who are joining us. And once again, my apologies for the delay in starting this live stream. The event is happening via Zoom and is being live streamed on YouTube. The chat function is enabled, as you would have seen, because I've just sent a message apologizing to all of you. If you would like to ask a question to any member of the panel, then please do ask a question via the chat function. If your question is directed to an individual panelist, please mention that. You're equally welcome to pose a question to the entire panel, and I will read out those questions at irregular intervals once the first part of the event has got over. I should add over here that if this event had been happening on site at LSE, then members of the audience at LSE have the right to not disclose their names and their identities while asking questions in public. So in keeping close to that spirit, I'll only be reading out your questions and not the names, so that we at least remain close to the idea of that. If you tweet, then the Twitter handles of all our speakers are given in the notes in front of you on the YouTube page. Please do tweet and tag us. And it is now my very pleasant duty to introduce the speakers for this afternoon's panel, each of whom is an expert. The order in which I'm going to introduce them is the order in which they will speak. We have decided that our the three speakers will make initial remarks for about 6 to 8 minutes, after which our discussant will take over, give his views, as well as carry the discussion forward. I will be tracking the questions online and will post them at irregular intervals in that segment of the event. Our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa, who is Senior Fellow in War Studies at King's College London and author of Military Inc. Inside Pakistan's Military Economy, which was published in 2007. Zafar Sobhan is a lawyer and journalist, is founding editor of the weekly Counterpoint, and is a political analyst and commentator on Bangladesh. Lisa Curtis is Senior Fellow and Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security in Washington, D.C., and board chair of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. I should also add in my correspondence with Lisa that I know that she has just been to Bangladesh. Our discussant this afternoon is Alexander Evans, who is Professor in Practice and Associate Dean for Strategic Development at the LSE School of Public Policy and a former British Acting High Commissioner to Pakistan. Everyone, welcome. A very warm welcome also to members of the audience, and my apologies once again. Ayesha, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Thank you, Nilanjan, for asking me to come and speak at this event, being amongst friends. It's also a very interesting topic, Pakistan and Bangladesh restarting relations. Now, I would like to be very specific that this is state-to-state relations. There's two segments of the relations. There's the society-to-society relations, which are almost missing there. Let me point that out first, that firstly, when Bangladesh used to be East Pakistan, the problem then was that the Western wing was not familiar with the Eastern wing, except for business investment, except for strategic interests. There was very little movement because, of course, there was 1,000 miles of enemy territory, which is India, lying between East Pakistan then and West Pakistan. Therefore, communication between the two societies, between the two peoples, was kind of more restricted, remains so. Despite that, under General Ziaur Rahman, when General Ziaur Rahman took over in Bangladesh, and afterwards, when BNP formed the government in the 1990s, relations had improved, but people-to-people relationship remains very restricted. One of the problems being that the bulk of West Pakistan has never invested in understanding the language spoken in Bangladesh, which is Bangla. Very little understanding, there's no expertise, and also the ethnic bias which existed in during the 1960s and the 70s, which is after Pakistan was formed in 1947. Now, that ethnic bias towards Bangladeshis remained and has existed. In fact, the only interaction really at a people-to-people level has been either limited number of students coming in to Pakistan to study. Pakistan has recently, in December, I believe, December or January, announced 300 scholarships for Bangladeshi students. Whether it's going to enhance, I mean, this is a drop in the ocean, does not necessarily enhance the understanding and sympathy and acceptability. That's one issue which remains. But the level at which the interaction has always remained a people-to-people level is really between the right wings, the religious right wings of the two societies. So, students, madrasa students have come from Bangladesh. They've been accepted, given an equal treatment. And let me also very quickly point out that as far as Bangladeshis are concerned, there's a lot of concentration. The concentration of Bangladeshis who remain there, remained in Pakistan after Bangladesh became a separate state, has been in Karachi, which is south of the country. And there is, I think, about 100,000 Bangladeshis who are there, who have not been given any identity, who have not been given Pakistanis, despite living for so many years, who have not gained, identity cards or any legal status, remain in a very poor state. Now, that's one reality of people to people, but here is state to state. And I remember that, Pakistan government at this point in time is extremely excited. And there is a huge gap which has been created due to the ongoing tension between Dhaka and New Delhi. It has created a space for Pakistan to occupy. So on the one hand, it has its friendship with China, and China is, let's not forget, is a major player in the region. So geopolitically, Pakistan has sought that help from China, but on the other, there is this independent state-to-state relationship which has grown, on the basis of the tension between India and Bangladesh. Now, it's almost like the direction which Pakistan-Bangladesh relations are going, it's like a dream come true. A dream which was interrupted when Awami League came into power in Dhaka, and for 14 to 15 years, there was almost no relationship between Islamabad and Dhaka. Direct flights were cancelled. There were problems getting visas for Pakistanis. There were issues with appointment of diplomats. The military training, Bangladeshi military officers would come for training to Pakistan. That got interrupted. So practically, there was no relationship. Now, prior to that, with BNP government during the early 1990s, 96, 94, 95, 96, that period, 2006, I remember, sorry, 2006, when I visited Bangladesh for the first time. BNP was there, and it was a very good, very kind of positive relationship between Pakistan and Bangladesh. And I remember 1990s, 1994, 95, one of the hopes that Pakistan had, Pakistani establishment, military establishment, was actually to turn Bangladesh into its strength vis-a-vis India. There were even, I mean, I remember attending a seminar in the Institute of Strategic Studies in Islamabad, which was attended by the Air Force Chief, then Air Force Chief, Pakistan Air Force Chief, and where the idea which was presented was that Pakistan Air Force would park some of its aircraft in Dhaka to be used, whenever there was a conflict. Now, that relationship got disrupted, and now it seems that we are back to building a geostrategic, a geopolitical linkage, where Pakistan sees itself as leader in, posing a leadership role in South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, and where it would take Bangladesh as its partner. Of course, we have the very hawkish elements in Islamabad who keep saying that, this is a point where Pakistan and Bangladesh should, re-merge back to the 1971 situation, which we know is not going to happen. The tensions remain there. I mean, there is the cons of the current ongoing relationship is that Bangladesh is asking for assets of, state assets of 1971. It's asking for a formal apology, which is not going to happen, because the narrative with the Pakistani establishment has built in so many years is that violence happened, but it happened not just with Pakistani military versus Bengalis in East Pakistan, but it happened with Pakistanis, Biharis, etc. So these are the two critical issues, besides, very quickly, that 200,000 Urdu-speaking Bangladeshis who were stranded in camps, in refugee camps in Bangladesh. I mean, Bangladesh government is saying, the Pakistan needs to get them to its side, which will create political issues in Pakistan. So again, all these issues are at a standstill. Definitely, Pakistani military is in a no mood to apologize. I mean, if they come anywhere close, it will be Pakistani military apologizing, but the Bangladeshi Mukti Bahani or the Bangladeshi government apologizing as well for the violence that took place during 1971. Strategically, there have been visits. There have been meeting between Muhammad Yunus and Shahbaz Sharif. As we speak, in fact, Pakistan Naval Chief is on a visit to Dhaka. Pakistani naval ship has been visiting.
I'm sure you
Military
have a
to
minute
yeah,
more.
yeah, yeah. Military to military relations are strengthening. There is a 2030 force enhancement plan, Bangladesh's plan, and they're interested in JF-17 Thunders, even Chinese J-10Cs, and there Pakistan's cooperation is necessary. The idea is that, because there is so much of silence on the India Bangladesh front, it's not moving. And especially with Sheikh Hasina in exile, it creates a lot of room. But I think my own personal assessment is that the relationship can get pushed to a point, but no more. I think the common border between India and Bangladesh is a reality which Pakistan cannot deny. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Aisha. I'm sorry to have rushed you, but that was great. And I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of these later on in the discussion. Our next speaker is Zafar Sobhan. Zafar is a lawyer and journalist, is founding editor of the weekly Counterpoint, and a political analyst and commentator on Bangladesh. Zafar, please speak now. You have 6 to 8 minutes. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, unmuting is always a good start. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I would like to start by saying that this is really a conversation which, from the Bangladeshi perspective, couldn't have happened 15 or 18 months ago, simply because the climate in the country was such that to be seen taking part in such a discussion with Pakistanis, to be taking part in such a discussion about the Bangladesh-Pakistan relationship would have been seen as a hostile act by the powers that be, the erstwhile Awami League government, which was removed from power last August. And it's really quite hard to emphasize enough to people who are not familiar with what the situation in Bangladesh was, just the level of difficulty there was with relationship to the Bangladesh-Pakistan relationship over the last 15 years. I'll give you a couple of examples. Ayesha had mentioned this, that, in terms of getting visas, it was very difficult. There used to be a journalist exchange program from between Pakistan and Bangladesh, where Bangladeshi journalists would go to Pakistan for a week and be sort of spied around. And for the last 10 or 15 years, you couldn't find anyone to go on that program, simply because they felt that if they went on such a program, that they would end up with their name on a list. So that was really kind of the situation. And you, of course, have to look at the Bangladesh-Pakistan relationship. You cannot look at it in isolation. You have to look at it in the context of the Bangladesh-India relationship, in the India-Pakistan relationship. Unfortunately, these things do not exist separate from one another. Now, when it comes to Bangladeshi-Pakistan ties, it's interesting that while the very anti-Pakistan position was taken by the previous Awami League government, that was not necessarily mirrored by the Bangladeshi public at large. Recently, we had an opinion poll which suggested that 70+% of the people of Bangladesh would like and would welcome good relations with Pakistan. And that was an interesting finding. And of course, that has been informally what research has shown, all through the years. And of course, it's interesting because, of course, Ayesha had mentioned that, there were no person-to-person or very few person-to-person contacts between Bangladesh and Pakistan, these last several decades. And of course, that's true because there's such a great geographical distance between the two countries. But in a sense, you could say that that works in favor of the relationship because, of course, when you do not have great person-to-person relations, you don't necessarily have bad person-to-person relations. I think part of the problem between Bangladesh and India is that there is a lot of communication between Bangladesh and India, and most Bangladeshis' experience of that is not positive, whereas most Bangladeshis possibly, may not have met or spoken with or interacted with a Pakistani in real life. And to the extent that they are familiar with Pakistanis is through watching Pakistani television, is through watching cricket, maybe through a diaspora community where, being South Asian is more of something which binds us together. And people tend to not think of themselves so much as separate nations. And of course, there is the issue of 1971. There is a lot of still feeling to do about the atrocities. But at the same time, I think most people in Bangladesh do recognize the fact that we're talking about 53, 54 years ago, and that this is not just a new generation, it's probably two new generations of Pakistanis who have been born since 1971, in that relationships can move beyond an unfortunate and tragic past. If you look at the experience of, let's say, France and Germany, I mean, of course, these are countries which have had a great deal of hostility last in the Second World War, but certainly even before that, yet they are now, they are now allies within the European Union. So if that is the case in France and Germany, there's no real reason why that need not be the case between Bangladesh and Pakistan. I also think that it's important to look at the fact that the countries have changed very much in the last 15 or 20 years. The big problem which India used to have vis-a-vis Bangladesh and Pakistan is that in the 1990s and in the 2000s, it was felt that Pakistan was really using Bangladesh as a strategic hub for anti-Indian activities. ISI was very active in Bangladesh at the time, and I think the fear among India is that something like that would re-emerge. But of course, what you have to take into consideration is the world has changed, and Bangladesh and Pakistan have changed. In the year 2000, Bangladesh's economy was about $50 billion. Pakistan's economy is twice as big as Bangladesh's was in the year 2000. Fast forward to 2025, the Bangladesh economy is now bigger than Pakistan's. On a per capita basis, it's 35% bigger than Pakistan's. The notion that Pakistan would be able to project power through Bangladesh against India in the same way as it had done a few decades ago is, I think, largely unrealistic. And speaking to Aisha's point that there's a lot of excitement in Pakistan that maybe Bangladesh can be a strategic ally vis-a-vis India. I think on that note, Bangladesh would be very cautious, more cautious, perhaps, simply because to have a better relationship with Pakistan does not necessarily mean for us that we should have a negative relationship with India. At the end of the day, we do have a 4,000-kilometer border with India, and having, India and Pakistan have an adversarial, hostile relationship, and this is something which has been the case, largely since independence, but certainly since the 1960s. Whether it would work for Bangladesh at the same token, it's almost certain that such an approach would not be in Bangladesh's interest. And I alluded earlier to a opinion poll which suggested that 70+% of the Bangladeshi population would like a positive relationship with Pakistan. That's the same in terms of Bangladeshis who want a positive relationship with India. So our Bangladesh is calculus vis-a-vis India and Pakistan is a little bit different. Yes, we want a better relationship with Pakistan, but we don't necessarily want to have it at the expense of a decent or at least a workable relationship with India. There are many strains with the relationship with India right now for a number of reasons. You mentioned Sheikh Hasina still being harbored in India, but by the same token, most Bangladeshis are realistic enough to understand that an adversarial relationship between Bangladesh and India probably does not serve Bangladesh well. So there is that sort of difference. But by the same token, of course, while we should have good relations with Pakistan,
if you could please conclude, and we'll come back to what you're saying.
Yeah, sure. The last point I would make is that while it would be good for Bangladesh to have a better relationship with Pakistan than we've had in the last 15 years, at the end of the day, if you look at the size of trade between the two countries and you look at other areas of cooperation, there are not that many areas in which it would be that advantageous for Bangladesh. Our future, strategically, economically, is more to the east rather than the west. So I'll leave it at that, and then we can pick up the thread later.
Thank you very much, Zafar, and my apologies for having interrupted you.
No, not at all.
Our next speaker is Lisa Curtis, who is Senior Fellow and Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security in Washington, D.C. And Lisa is also Board Chair of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Lisa, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Well, thank you, Nilanjan. Thank you, Alexander, and the London School of Economics South Asia Center for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here speaking about this important topic, which frankly is not getting much attention in Washington, D.C. So grateful for you all having this important discussion. And as Nilanjan mentioned, I was in Bangladesh 3 weeks ago. I was actually in India last week, and I was in Pakistan in January, the beginning of the year. And, I think that Zafar is right that we have to approach this subject within the context of the broader South Asia region. So that's what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. So following the student protest, last summer The interim government, of course, led by Muhammad Yunus, has taken several steps to improve Bangladesh's relationship with Pakistan, which, of course, had been strained severely under the Sheikh Hasina regime. And we have seen a series of visits, some of which have been alluded to. The January visit of the principal staff officer in the Bangladeshi Armed Forces, Lieutenant General Kamral Hassan, visiting Islamabad, meeting with Asim Munir, the Field Marshal of Pakistan. Then in February, Bangladesh's naval chief visiting Pakistan, followed by the visit of Pakistan's foreign secretary to Dhaka in mid-April. Pakistani Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar visiting Bangladesh in late August. And of course, over the weekend, as Ayesha mentioned, for the first time since 1971, a Pakistan Navy warship has docked at Chittagong Port in Bangladesh for a goodwill visit. So we've had this, string of visitors and engagement between the two countries, which is certainly notable in and of itself. But I think it is particularly notable in light of the current India-Pakistan tensions and the brief war that was fought between the two countries in May. And I want to say just a word on the Trump administration's approach to India in the aftermath of that conflict, because it forms part of the story and picture that I'm painting here. And of course, President Trump, I think, erred in expecting India would acknowledge the U.S. role in effectuating a ceasefire between India and Pakistan. The concept of third-party mediation between India and Pakistan is anathema to Indians. And I think President Trump's repeated references to using tariff threats to bring about the ceasefire has really put Prime Minister Modi in a precarious political position. And so in this scenario where you have a steadily deteriorating relationship between the U.S. and India, and at the same time, the U.S. president is repeatedly showering praise on Pakistan, pursuing numerous business deals in cryptocurrency and critical minerals. I think in this context, it's not surprising that India is highly suspicious of the strengthening ties between Pakistan and Bangladesh. Now, India may be exaggerating to some extent the relationship and overestimating the level of cooperation between the Pakistan military and the Jamaat-e-Islami in Bangladesh. But at the same time, I think India's concerns are not completely ungrounded. For instance, shortly after the April 22nd terrorist attack in Indian Kashmir that killed 26 Indians, a retired Bangladeshi army general who is currently the chairperson of the National Independent Commission of Inquiry probing the 2009 Bangladeshi Rifles massacre, posted in his social media that, and I'm quoting here, "If India attacks Pakistan, Bangladesh should occupy the 7 states of Northeast India." And he goes on to say, "In this regard, I think it is necessary to start a discussion of a military system with China." So very highly provocative remark at a very tense time between India and Pakistan. And I was in India last week, as I mentioned, and some interlocutors even believe that the U.S. was actively trying to encircle India by cozying up to Pakistan and supporting anti-Hasina forces inside Bangladesh. Now, of course, this notion is utterly ridiculous, but I think what it shows is just how prevalent this suspicion and paranoia in India is about the U.S. role in the region and everything that's happening in these changing geopolitics that we are discussing. And, in this vein, we have to talk about China. We have to talk about the India-China relationship as well. And recent media reports indicate that India is fortifying its eastern border region at the Siliguri corridor. This is the thin strip of land that also borders Bangladesh, but it really is the sort of gateway from main India territory to its seven eastern states, the so-called Seven Sisters. And it happens to be near Doklam, where there was a major standoff between Chinese and Indian forces in the summer of 2017. So I think any new government, assuming we do have the elections in February in Bangladesh, which I think we will, but I think any new government in Bangladesh will have to factor all of these geostrategic realities into its foreign policy, and see the India-Bangladesh relationship in the context of India's relationships also with Pakistan and with China, with which, of course, it's fought conflicts and wars in the past. And I know Bangladeshi leaders are frustrated that India supported Sheikh Hasina for so long, despite her increasingly authoritarian policies. But I think that there is recognition, I think, as Zafar was saying, that India is important for Bangladesh's economy and its future prosperity. And, while I was in Bangladesh just a few weeks ago, I did hear Bangladeshi officials, as well as experts, as well as politicians within the BNP, the party expected to do well in the upcoming election, that the number one foreign policy priority for the new Bangladeshi government would be to repair relations with India. So I think this is something that needs to be factored in. And talking about the Bangladesh-India tensions, things are not perfect between Pakistan and Bangladesh either. I mean, yes, there is the excitement of this recent spurt of engagement between the two, but as Ayesha mentioned, Bangladesh is still looking for an apology from Pakistan for the atrocities committed by the Pakistan military against the people in Bangladesh during the independence movement. That is something that is still, on the minds, even though it was so long ago. There is still that sentiment there in Bangladesh. And I also want to second something Zafar said about the changes in Bangladesh and the economic growth that has occurred there over the last 25 years, which has made Bangladesh a real economic powerhouse in the region. Its socioeconomic indicators, by many accounts, are better than Pakistan's. So I think, rather than this idea of Pakistan bringing in Bangladesh along, I think they're going to have to establish a relationship that's one of equal footing. And I think, unless Pakistani officials approach the relationship in that way, that could add some difficulties as they're trying to forge this new understanding. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Alexander Evans, who is Professor in Practice and an Associate Dean for Strategic Development at the LSE School of Public Policy and former British Acting High Commissioner to Pakistan, has very kindly agreed to be discussant this afternoon. Alexander has the joy of having two roles at this event. He can be a panelist and give his views and then carry on the discussion, or he can be the discussant only. So Alexander, over to you. Before that, if I could just say to all of you who are watching, if you'd like to ask any questions, please do use the chat box function in YouTube, which is enabled to ask questions. If you'd like to pose it to a particular speaker, then please mention that name. Otherwise, you're equally welcome to pose a question to the entire panel. Alexander, please speak now.
Nilanjan, thanks very much, and my thanks to Lisa, Zafar, and Ayesha as well. It's always good to bring old acquaintances back together for a discussion like this. And I mean, the first thing is actually this is a subject that isn't well ventilated, right? I mean, I think it's worth just noting the degree to which on any discussion of South Asia, discussions about India and Pakistan, and at least until fairly recently, Afghanistan, tended to suck most of the oxygen out of the room. So if you are another state in South Asia, even a state as populous, as economically fast-moving, and as dynamic as Bangladesh, actually it doesn't get as much airtime or attention in its own right as it should. And we're all too often looking, I think, at countries through great power relationship eyes rather than looking at the relationships that exist between countries in a given region. So I think it's really welcome that we're having this brief discussion on Pakistan-Bangladesh relations. I'll perhaps offer a few remarks in a personal context. I'm not a Bangladesh specialist. I've mainly worked in and on Pakistan and India, as well as in Afghanistan. But perhaps first of all, I mean, I think Lisa's right to suggest that there's probably is an India-Pakistan dynamic at play here, right? We saw the crisis in April, May this year. There is a slight sense that other relationships prosper when India-Pakistan relationships, the India-Pakistan relationship doesn't prosper. Whether that be a relationship with China, whether that be other states' relationships with Pakistan, or indeed with India. But there is also a dynamic here about China and India in the region, right? And what we've seen, I think, persistently over the last really 20-25 years is economic and geostrategic competition between India and China for influence in South Asia. And indeed, I think one of the most contentious things I've heard debated in New Delhi has been the notion that China is a South Asian actor. Because the very supposition that China is a South Asian actor seems to be suggestive of trying to rein in or diminish India's role in the region. But what you have seen is this economic competition, and it's articulated through the fact that only Bhutan now is a country in the region where India-Bhutan economic ties outweigh China bilateral ties with India's neighbours. So one is you have this wider context of economic competition. You also have that dynamic on India-Pakistan competition and indeed the continuing concern about terrorism in the region. The good news under the Hasina government was that actually the terrorist threat in Bangladesh diminished substantially. And that was to the benefit not just of Bangladeshis, but to India and of the wider world. And regardless of what your position might be on the Hasina government, I think the importance of trying to make sure that counterterrorism dividend isn't put at risk in the new equilibrium is going to be a challenge for the next government in Bangladesh, but also for Bangladesh's international partners. But there's also a story here, surely, of a low level of South Asian integration. That'll be familiar to anybody on this call who knows South Asia. The reality is that most South Asian countries deal much more with outside states than with each other. And that's actually been an inhibitor of economic growth. And I would argue in some ways an inhibitor of hopefully the positive people-to-people ties. I agree with the comments made earlier that sometimes the absence of those people-to-people ties does take away, it does defang some of the risk that comes with it. But this may also be the excitement about the Pakistan-Bangladesh relationship may also reflect the fact that there has been so little to constitute relationships between South Asian states where it's not mediated through this dynamic relationship with either India or externally with China. I think speakers, Ayesha's reminded us about the history, Lisa and Zafar too, and that's not gone away, but we are several generations removed now from 1971, which I think allows for a different conversation to a conversation about the war crimes trials that took place in the Hasina period, or if you like, that legacy politics of looking back rather than looking forward. I'd be curious, and perhaps Lisa, this is perhaps something to come back to you in a minute on, I'd be curious about the perception of US policy here. Because certainly one of the conspiracy theories that's done the rounds since the Hasina government was removed after a protest was that there must be a hidden hand behind it, right? There were a bundle of people saying that this must be, Washington's so clever that they managed to get rid of a government, without any visible of this. So I'd just be curious again about the fact that in an era when you'd think that there would be a renewed appreciation for the autonomy of South Asian states in their own region, why is there that persistent kind of Frankenstein perception of US policymaking and conspiracy theorizing about popular protests, but didn't appear to have any US hand in them, but somehow that being tied into US foreign policy? And also, there is another US dimension. I mean, as anybody who watches the various gatherings, whether that's Sharm el-Sheikh and President Trump on the Middle East, or indeed other meetings where President Trump consistently talks about his favorite field marshal, and I think he is referring to General Munir in that context. The warmth, the extraordinary warmth of Pakistan-US ties at the moment under President Trump are another factor that perhaps we haven't raised so far. Lisa, you did raise, of course, some of the dynamics in India-Pakistan relations with President Trump. But as Zafar says, this is not really a zero-sum relationship, right? It's a bit more complicated than that. And the temptation at any given moment for us to hit the extrapolitis button, right, and assume that in the given moment right now, what we've seen, this flurry, Lisa, as you described, of diplomatic and military diplomacy, that we would expect that to sort of grow and persist. Well, actually, isn't this a little bit like the immediate moment after Brexit in the UK when we didn't mention the word Europe for a while until we were okay about talking about it again and having sort of normal relationships with European partners and geographic neighbours? So the final question, I guess, for me would just be how much is it tempting to overplay this particular moment? That may be very welcome in Islamabad. It may be welcome to some in Bangladesh and indeed to some in China. But is it really load bearing if we take a view of a couple of years hence, regardless of which way elections might go, regardless of whether we see a BNP government back in power in Dhaka? My final comment would just be about the people-to-people ties. Ayesha, you rightly said that some of the people ties that did exist were on the right politically, or indeed on religious right, or just amongst religious communities. One always had this tradition of Tablighi Jamaat delegations going to Bangladesh for ties with Qaumi madrasas in Bangladesh. But to what extent was there a little bit of a temptation to overplay how toxic or dangerous some of that might be? The reality is that most Qaumi madrasas in Bangladesh were not sources of terrorism or instability, and actually perhaps reconnecting the tissue between Bangladeshi religious communities and Pakistani religious communities might actually play a positive role for both, just as some of the renewed engagement between Darul Uloom Deoband in India and other communities might also play a positive role for both. So I just wonder if that question might be added to the mix. But perhaps I'll stop there and if I may, Nilanjan, sort of abusing my chair / rapporteur, or perhaps could ask Lisa first to reflect on this question about the US as an actor here, because the US is perceived to be an actor. Is it an actor? How important is it? Is the Trump effect something that we should be looking at carefully in the region?
Well, I think there's always been this idea of a hidden hand of the United States throughout the region that we have to contend with. But I do want to take a couple moments to talk about a particularly pernicious disinformation campaign against the International Republican Institute, which is a organization here in the United States funded by the U.S. Congress, which promotes democracy overseas. It has a Democratic counterpart, the National Democratic Institute, and it's overseen by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is part of the sort of family of organizations that are working to build up political parties, to ensure free and fair elections, to ensure that there are free media environments. Very important work that these organizations are doing. But there was a very pernicious disinformation campaign against IRI that we actually, CNAS, explored quite deeply. And what we found is that they had actually taken documents, IRI documents, and doctored them and presented these in both Indian media and Russian media as being the programs of the IRI. So really quite damaging, blaming, saying there was a foreign hand in the student uprisings in Bangladesh. But essentially, it was about discrediting the students and, kind of saying that, there was foreign support for them, which is really trying to delegitimize the students and discredit what they were doing, and, trying to make it look like it wasn't a sort of homegrown organic process as a result of the repression that the Sheikh Hasina government was exercising against the people. So that was a very clear example of a pernicious disinformation campaign. But I think what you're saying is, how is the Trump factor going to influence all this? And I talked a little bit about it already, that the repeated references to how President Trump resolved the India-Pakistan dispute, where actually I do think the U.S. did play a critical role in getting that ceasefire. But I think the mistake was made by the Trump administration in expecting that India was somehow going to provide credit for that. It's just simply, they cannot do that. Within India, there is the position that disputes between India and Pakistan are resolved bilaterally, not with any third-party mediation. So I think that should have been understood, and that's caused a lot of static in the U.S.-India relationship. So that's one way. So I think we can't avoid that President Trump and his unique approach to foreign policy, a very personalized sort of approach that isn't always sensitive to the context in which he is speaking, is going to cause, some impacts in the region and how they are approaching relationships with one another. But I think, as they get more used to this unique way of conducting foreign policy from the Trump administration, hopefully there will be sensitivity as they're dealing bilaterally with relationships. So I think, that's kind of the best that we can hope, that there is mutual recognition among the countries of the region that they need to, maybe sometimes insulate their relationships from this unpredictability or personalization of foreign policy that any one of them could find themselves a victim of.
Thank you, Lisa. And Ayesha, could I just ask you about, the point that Zafar made, which I thought was an interesting one, right? That at least in polling terms, it seems there is an appetite to have better relations with Pakistan from Bangladeshis when you ask them. But there's also the appetite for that not to be, it seems, at the expense of positive relationships with India. And that doesn't just seem to be the dimension of Bengalis speaking onto Bengalis, as it were, but it's a beyond Bagdogra question in West Bengal. Ayesha, under those circumstances, how much can Pakistan's leadership, both civilian and military, expect to really gain from this intensive effort around military and a political diplomacy? Is there really a dividend here for Pakistan that would be bankable in the medium to long term, do you think?
Right. Thank you, Alexander, for this question. You see, the reason I kind of laid out in my earlier comments the separation between state and society is that because there is too much of a top-down relationship as it's being built, which has its problems. Economically, 27% trade has been increased. Pakistan looks at, at one level, Pakistan looks at Bangladesh as more than just military terms. They're trying to expand trade as well, but there are limits. Both countries at this point in time have, their economic problems, and both countries cannot really feed each other at one level. So that leaves us one dimension of relationship which dominates all others, which is military to military. And my reading of the relationship is that there is far more excitement in Pakistan than in Bangladesh. Bangladesh has its issues to look at. Right now, I think, let's speak it out. One of the issues even in geopolitical terms is Bangladesh itself is dominated by Muhammad Yunus and his politics, and we're not very sure. Besides the promise that he's given, which is that he will hold elections when they're to be held. Is he going to add more to the relationship, which leaves something behind for the next government which takes over? The other is that, you know, where does Pakistan hope? I mean, right now, the problem at Pakistan's end is that it's so caught by its own narrative of having played a major role in the recent and performed very well in the recent conflict between India and Pakistan, which is constantly being kind of presented internationally by Donald Trump, that it believes that now it has a major geopolitical role to play in South Asia. And it's trying to expand, push it, and bring Bangladesh on board as a partner. That long term, even there is a change of government, which it hopes that the next government will not be a Awami League, it will be a BNP government. So they get another 4 to 5 years to build that relationship, to strengthen it. I mean, yes, there is probably somewhere this understanding that if there is an election where Awami League comes back, yes, Pakistan will get a pushback. But it considers this moment as an opportunity to build as far as it can. So it's trying to expand wherever it can. I mean, there have been several visits by the ISI chief to Bangladesh, exploring, and this is where the problematic right wing to right wing relationship comes in. Can the right wing on both sides build a positive role? I mean, again, as we speak, Maulana Fazlur Rahman of Deoband is on a 8 to 10 days visit of Bangladesh. Now, that is a very particular kind of a relationship. And these Deobandis are not kind of building something positive in Pakistan itself. So what to expect, from them to build a positive linkage with Bangladesh? I mean, there is an assumption here that most of Bangladesh is right-wing thinking. It's not. Right now, the problem that Bangladesh always faces is that it's divided in the middle between, the Awami League supporters and the BNP supporters with Jamaat Islami as its partner. And this is what the Pakistani military is trying to exploit. Also, I think what is important to understand, where Washington, if it's not thinking, should look more carefully, is that Pakistan's important partner is China, which already has a foothold in Bangladesh. I mean, in terms of trade ties, in terms of economic ties, and also in terms of military ties. What is being discussed here with Bangladesh's not so deep pockets is purchase of equipment, military equipment, which is of Chinese origin. JF-17 Thunder and J-10Cs, and this visit of the naval ship is exactly in that regard. So Pakistan is expanding its military market. Whether it'll be able to expand it and use it someday against India, I think that's a big question mark.
Thank you, Ayesha. And just turning finally to Zafar on this. I mean, Zafar, by the way, very nice to see you. I should explain to our audience that Zafar and I were at Yale together, so we were fellow students for a period of time in America. But Zafar, I wanted to ask you really this question about we've talked a little bit about the proximity and the intimacy of relationship between Bangladesh and India. Not always an easy relationship, but a close relationship. And if you like, some of the greater distance, both historically and perhaps emotionally, in terms of that relationship with Pakistan, at least until the situation this year. Can you tell us a little bit about the relationship with China? Because if there is a strong China dimension on this, I mean, beyond just the economic, how much does that play? And is Bangladesh going to be shaped? Will future governments in Dhaka be shaped by what preference might be in Beijing or Delhi or Islamabad or Washington? Or are governments in Bangladesh largely going to be looking out for what's in Bangladesh's national interest? And how might a future government, BNP or not, interpret that?
Yes, I think one of the interesting things about Bangladesh is that periodically, if you read in the media, people will fulminate against India and they will talk about the massive trade deficit Bangladesh has with India. But the fact that we have a much larger trade deficit with China is something which rarely is discussed, or if it is discussed, it's not discussed in any negative manner whatsoever. So in that sense, China has managed to fly under the radar. And of course, there are reasons for this. China does not share a border with Bangladesh. The relationship Bangladeshis have with Chinese is very different from the relationships we have with India. A big problem in the Indo-Bangladesh relationship right now is the tenor of the BJP government, which has been in power in India for over a decade. In a lot of the rhetoric they use, in terms of their, in West Bengal and in the northeastern states, a lot of their electoral appeal is nakedly anti-Bangladeshi. A lot of the rhetoric, people up to and including the Home Minister, uses nakedly anti-Bangladeshi. So of course that resonates negatively, whereas you never hear anything like that coming from the Chinese side. But slowly, of course, China has developed quite a footprint in Bangladesh. Economically, they've been also a good development partner, and they continue. And in fact, when it comes to military hardware and software, I think to a certain extent, we see Chinese influence there as well. Moving forward, it's a very interesting time for Bangladesh, and what we have tried to do always is, triangulate our relationship with all of the powers surrounding us: China, India, once upon a time Pakistan, though I think that has waned in importance lately. Japan, for that matter, if you're talking about a big economic and development partner of Bangladesh, and of course the United States. And as the tensions between the United States and China ratchet up, I feel that Bangladesh could become a much more significant player. And it is going to put Bangladesh in a unenviable and perhaps difficult situation to really try to figure out how to manage this relationship, because at the same time, we really are dependent on all of these countries around us economically. We are not in a position we can cut off ties or curtail ties significantly with any one of these countries. And to the extent that we are permitted to continue triangulating our relationships with them, I think things are going to be okay. But it is not beyond the realms of possibility that in the future, maybe in the very near future, that Bangladesh will be called upon to take a side and to take a stronger action economically, which is going to be very difficult for us. Already we've seen with the Trump administration, Bangladesh is now scrambling to import more goods from the US so that our balance of trade is equalized, which will then have presumably a positive impact in terms of the tariff negotiations with the United States. But this is, of course, it's very tricky for us because there are simply not that many things Bangladesh is actually in a position to buy from the United States. And if you buy more from one country, that means you're buying less from another. And so these challenges will remain. I would say that in my experience and what I have seen in terms of how they have comported themselves in Bangladesh, China plays a very low-key role. I think most people in Bangladesh, for instance, as I said, would be surprised to learn that there are such large economic ties between Bangladesh and China. And most of what China does is very quiet as they slowly gain and increase their influence. And I think the other thing from the Chinese perspective is that I think they also recognize to some extent how important Bangladesh is strategically for India and how threatened India feels by a greater Chinese footprint in Bangladesh, especially in light of what has happened in Nepal, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. India feels very encircled, and it really feels sort of Bangladesh is the final frontier. And China, I think, recognizes that and doesn't want to paint India into a corner. So while it will slowly and quietly increase its footprint in Bangladesh, I don't think it'll want to do it in such an obvious way that that will lead to greater tensions in the region.
Zafar, thank you very much. Well, look, amidst triangles and squares and quads and different patterns of international relations, I think Foreign Minister Jaishankar of India talks about a multi-vector foreign policy. I think what you're describing is multi-vector positioning for all these states involved, and triangles tend to have quite sharp ends, right? So it's quite difficult to navigate. Nilanjan, back to you. Have we got questions online that you might want to bring in?
No, not as yet. But one of the things I wanted to mention, Alexander, in response to what you were saying about the whole conversation about a possible role of the US in toppling the Awami League government, is that what I was doing was I was trying to search for a tweet that I had read, but this concerns St. Martin's Island, and the whole conversation that Hasina had, where she said that there was this whole thing of US interest in St. Martin's Island and how she had refused, and therefore, the US was fomenting these student protests. And I just thought I'd mention that there was a source to that smoke. There was the leader herself was at that time saying for whether rightly or wrongly, but I just thought, no. I can't see any questions as yet. So all of you who are watching, if you would like to ask a question, please do. But I think we can carry on with the conversation. Sorry, Ayesha, you were going to say something.
You just wanted to make a comment.
You wanted to respond to what I just said.
Very quick comment on the conversation. Zafar's comment about China not actually interfering. Now, interestingly, that is basic China model. It doesn't interfere. It gently tells its friends things to do, which they may or may not listen. I mean, it has tried to kind of settle down relations, bring appeasement between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Hasn't worked. Both parties haven't listened. Before, during Kargil, it tried to kind of talk to Pakistan vis-a-vis India, but has been telling Pakistan to have trade with India. Doesn't listen. Islamabad doesn't listen, so it leaves it there. I think for China, it has this confidence that in terms of economic relations, it has stable, steady economic relations with in South Asia, with Pakistan, with Bangladesh. And also it doesn't have to be forceful, because Pakistan is playing the role and filling the gap which is there. And so there is a lot of conversation which must be going on between Pakistan and China over Bangladesh. So China doesn't have to interfere directly. And one very quick point is that I think, yes, Washington is absent in terms of its current attention on Bangladesh, but it's also because Trump is so distracted and is so much more concentrating on Central Asia rather than this part of South Asia. That's all I want to add.
Yeah, I think, Nilanjan, if I can just chime in on your, I don't want to call it a conspiracy theory, although it sounds like it might be. I'm not really familiar with this issue of St. Martin's Island or U.S. interests, but I'm quite dubious, and it sounds very much like the case of the disinformation campaign against the International Republican Institute, in that it's a way to claim that it's the U.S. behind the movement to oust Sheikh Hasina, which has the goal of discrediting the students. and discrediting the fact that there was a great deal of unhappiness with how Sheikh Hasina was running the government and her repression, her stifling of the media environment, disappearances that occurred under her rule, and not giving the political opposition any space at all to operate. So I think this falls in that category of a way to try to foist the blame for the student uprising on the United States in order to discredit what was the very organic response to her increasing repressive rule.
Zafar, did you want to come back to the points that Ayesha made, or
no? But I think if I could just amplify Lisa's point that we have heard these misinformation and disinformation campaigns, and they are ongoing. Just earlier today, the former education minister gave an interview where he, of course, regurgitated all of these conspiracy theories, and he suggested that one of the reasons that the US had taken this action was because Bangladesh did not support it vis-a-vis Ukraine. And and it's interesting that, of course, in his interview, the St. Martin's doesn't feature, so it seems as though they've kind of tossed that as a reason they've come up with a new one. But it's very clear that this is a sort of a coordinated campaign which is coming out of from the Awami League, who have set up their sort of headquarters in India, and with an eye to destabilizing the current situation in Bangladesh ahead of elections. To what extent they have the tacit or actual overt approval of the Indian government for this campaign is hard to say, but it's very much amplified in Indian media, and interestingly, as with this last interview, Russian media as well, which is quite fascinating.
Well, and if I may come in on that, and there was, look, there's been a long history of challenges around disinformation and conspiracy theories in South Asia, just as in many other regions of the world, right? And I think we're just hopefully in an era now of weapons of mass distraction, right? The fact that social media and other channels can be used more avidly for this kind of material, but hopefully a slightly more thoughtful population. It's not to say we're immune from it, but we can be a little bit more alert in terms of what we consume, what we check as well. But in that regard, I would also just sort of perhaps pause for a moment. I spent quite a lot of time living in and working in India as well as in Pakistan. And, I can understand, when I was in Delhi late last year in December, just the general air of concern about the changes that have taken place in Bangladesh, and a concern that India might be directly disadvantaged by these, either in terms of the breaking of bilateral relations, or in terms of India-Pakistan, or indeed Bangladesh-China, but equally concerns about renewed potential for political violence or activities that might undermine peace and security in the region. And it seems that those are not unreasonable concerns for any state to have, particularly around these issues of terrorism. So I just sort of put that on the table as well. But I think there is an interesting angle here, right? Which is, and perhaps Zafar, I'd be interested in a thought from you on this, which is, we have spoken before about the challenge of democracy in a country like Bangladesh, and the role of political violence, of mass stands, these sort of thugs who are used as intermediaries in political violence as well. Presumably, the pathway for Bangladesh in the next couple of years, is there a pathway back towards a single dominant party, again, whatever position it might hold on international affairs? Or is there a pathway towards properly competitive electoral politics? That's going to be really material for the future of Bangladesh, isn't it? And will also have presumably a wider effect if one's thinking about other societies and states in the region. Bangladesh may not be, it may not make the weather, but it's part of the weather system of South Asia. And what's your sense? If you were to put your prospectoscope cap on and gaze forward a couple of years, Zafar, how confident are you that sort of full multi-party democracy in Bangladesh, informed multi-party democracy that can be supportive to Bangladesh's future and enterprise, will return as a fundamental reality?
It's an interesting question in light of the upcoming elections, which are scheduled to be held in February. I mean, there's sort of good news and bad news. I mean, I think they will be competitive. I think we're not going to see them dominated by one party, which in this context would be the BNP. I think we're actually going to see a surprisingly good showing from the Jamaat-e-Islami, and that's an interesting new development in the context of Bangladeshi politics. The Awami League will not be allowed to participate in this election. Nevertheless, they still command a certain percentage of the vote, a significant percentage of the vote, one would imagine, and certainly which is borne out by the polling. And so in time, they would need to be reintegrated into the political future of Bangladesh. I feel that it is possible. I think if the one thing which we can accomplish. I think we had many great hopes for reform, which perhaps have not come to fruition after August. But one of the things which will happen, or can happen, and I'm hopeful that will happen, is that A, we will be able to have representative elections again, which we haven't had in Bangladesh since 2008. And B, that the relationship between the rulers and the ruled in Bangladesh has fundamentally been altered by the student uprising, the people's uprising of last summer. And that will, again, fundamentally change the way the political parties conduct themselves when they are in office. I feel that that is a shift which is taking place in the Bangladeshi polity, that something has changed. Whether that will then have a knock-on effect throughout the region, throughout the world, remains to be seen. But I'm very hopeful that the upcoming elections in Bangladesh, they're not going to solve all our problems, but I think they can be the first step in a sort of a resurgence or some kind of moving forward to. And of course, it's not as though this is, once we did have a much better democracy in Bangladesh in the past. It's not as though this is a straight line. We've actually moved backwards in the last 15 years. So if we could get back to the state we were in the 1990s and the early 2000s, that would be a wonderful thing. And I'm hopeful that this will actually be the first step towards that. So yes.
Thanks, Zafar. And Lisa, can I just quickly ask you? I mean, look, you have a unique vantage point. You've been a think tanker. You've got academic credentials. You've worked in the State Department and in the White House. There is a fact at the moment that with the Trump administration has fewer people working on South Asia, and fewer people in the foreign policy machinery than previous administrations, and indeed a much smaller White House and National Security Council staff. Just one question, if I may, Lisa. How much does just the bandwidth of have you got senior people working on this impact on US engagement? Second question, if I may. If one of the temptations, and we talked about it earlier, is to overplay and over-exaggerate US influence or US activity, is there also a similar risk that we can sometimes overplay or over-exaggerate Chinese influence on the region as well? Because in a sense, both of those tend to come in similar but slightly different bottled flavors.
Mm-hmm. Well, good questions, both. On the first question, I think you're absolutely right. I think we are dealing with, in the second Trump administration with, less expertise, less people in general. We've seen a lot of, senior talent getting kicked out of the State Department. We've seen the National Security Council being decimated really in its size. I think, the number of people I had working for me as senior director for South Asia was a lot more than the current senior director for South and Central Asia has working under him. So I think there is just less bandwidth in our foreign policy establishment under the Trump administration. I think that's a fact. And, let's face it, Bangladesh had not always gotten the attention it deserved in the best of times, in the most, staffed up times. So I think that is a factor that we have to be aware of. So I think that's just something to keep in mind. In terms of Chinese influence, are we over exaggerating that? I don't think so, because I've seen what happened in Sri Lanka. The 99-year lease on Hambantota Port, Sri Lanka getting over indebted to China. So the sense is, Sri Lanka has learned its lesson on how to deal with China, but also in Nepal. We had similar efforts in Nepal where the Chinese were trying to interfere with the U.S. providing, assistance through the Millennium Challenge Corporation, for example. And so but one of the problems is that unfortunately, the U.S., by not placing value on its soft power, meaning, the destruction of U.S. aid, the cutting of U.S. foreign assistance. Bangladesh is one of the worst hit. Bangladesh had received more U.S. foreign assistance than any other Asian country, and a lot of this was going toward the Rohingya. Well, that is now, been severely curtailed. And so there are many questions about what does that mean, for stability if the Rohingya are receiving a lot less U.S. assistance. And what does that mean in terms of, will China start trying to take up some of the slack left by the U.S. not providing foreign assistance? I think there are a lot of questions on that, because China's more interested in providing loans rather than, direct foreign assistance in the form of grants. So, but, all of these questions are out there and these are due to the different way that the Trump administration is handling U.S. foreign policy. And I think that, we are likely to see greater Chinese influence as a result of the U.S. Not exercising that soft power influence to the degree it has in the past.
Okay.
Lisa, thank you very much. I think we're coming to the final throws now, but Nilanjan, back to you, because I think there's a final quick fire round, right?
Sure. Thank you very much. We really are, because we have about 4 minutes remaining, and I wanted to give all of you the chance to make some closing remarks, especially about where each of you think Bangladesh-Pakistan relations are headed, irrespective of who comes to power, and also what you think about where they'd be headed if A or B or C comes to power. Noting, as Zafar said just now, that BNP was banned from elections and etc., all this kind of stuff. Also, any lingering support for Awami League. So, Ayesha, do you want to go first?
Sure. Nilanjan, thanks. Thanks to LSC. I think there are serious limits to the relationship. On the one hand, the political discussion in Pakistan around Bangladesh-Pakistan relations is that here are these countries which are worried about India's power, the growth of Hindutva in India, that they're coming together. And here are these political parties, even younger political parties representing left, saying the same thing. I mean, they're sounding the same as any centrist. Within the political sphere, there isn't a lot of discussion on Bangladesh-Pakistan relations. It's a very, I insist, it's a very government-to-government, state-to-state relationship, which itself poses its limitations. So, and there is very little that they can offer each other. Now, there is a gap which Rawalpindi and Islamabad see, which is there because of the ongoing tensions between Bangladesh and India. And the fact that India is so invested in Sheikh Hasina and Awami League, they've not carefully looked at BNP. I would argue that BNP itself, if it comes to power, is not going to hold back and say, all right, I've had bad relations with India, or India has supported Awami League, and therefore I'm not going to kind of re-establish relations with India. I think BNP will do that as well. Now, the moment that happens, the moment there would be some normalization between India and Bangladesh, um, Pakistan and Bangladesh relations will remain, but um, the priority that they have at the moment, in Islamabad, it will then get pushed back. I think
Sure.
where Pakistan sees the relations, bilateral relations, is really an investment, a long-term investment uh, in geopolitics of South Asia, where it posits itself as one of the partners and not where it had been pushed back by a Awami League. There isn't a lot that will happen, but it has entered into that geopolitical game within the region yet again.
Okay, thank you. Zafar.
Yes, I think that there are various constituencies in Bangladesh when it comes to the Bangladesh-Pakistan relationship. I am largely in agreement with Ayesha that I think what we will see post-elections is a more pragmatic and realistic approach to Indo-Bangladesh relations, which will then have a knock-on impact on Pakistan-Bangladesh relations. Now, here, the danger for Bangladesh is this, is that there will remain a large constituency within the country, and you already see it. It is making up a large part of the discussion prior to elections in terms of the pre-election discussion. And it's not just a question of BNP versus Jamaat-e-Islami, which are the two main parties contesting the contest. Even within the BNP, you see this discussion in terms of two wings of the party. So there will remain a significant population in Bangladesh which would like to actually see Bangladesh have far closer ties with Pakistan in far more adversarial ties with India. I think it is a minority position at present, but it exists. Now, the question here is whether Pakistan will choose to try and exploit that position and try and promote these political actors in Bangladesh on the theory that this will advance their own strategic interests. Or will they too take a more realistic position and say, well, look, if we have a BNP government in power, it's certainly going to be better for us than the situation we had in the last 15 years when the Awami League were there, and we should leave it at that rather than trying to push for a maximal encirclement of India. So a lot depends on the position taken by Pakistan after Bangladesh's elections and how they choose to navigate that split, and whether they choose to be, the words I would use are more pragmatic, or whether they choose to try and support something more adversarial. My hope is that they will also strategically retreat and figure that they're certainly in a better place than they were 2 years ago, and they can build on that rather than pushing too far along the lines of adversary.
Okay, great. Lisa,
Yes.
future Bangladesh-Pakistan relations?
Yeah, well, I think once the election is held and we have an elected government in power, I think you will see a balanced approach to foreign policy. I think the sort of rapprochement with Pakistan will continue, but I think there also is recognition that the India relationship is extremely important for Bangladesh for economic reasons, sharing the border. And so I think there will be an effort to get that relationship back on track from the new government. And I think there have been lessons learned in seeing how China operates in other parts of South Asia, so that there will be an effort to have sort of this balanced relationships with all three of the countries. In terms of the Awami League, I think the fact that that party has been suspended from participating in the election will raise some questions about the inclusivity of the election. I understand the deep anger at the Awami League because of Sheikh Hasina's repressive rule. But it's a major political party, and eventually a new leader will have to take control of the party. So the question is, by keeping the Awami League out of this election, are we in fact losing an opportunity to see new leadership come up within the party? I think it's always better to have an inclusive election that has multiple political parties participating. So I think that's just one of the questions that could be raised during the election.
We've just had a question pop up which says, what does an India-Bangladesh rapprochement post look like post-February? Alexander, I am going to give you the last word, of course, but there is another very important thing that we haven't discussed in large measure because it wasn't part of, the how we had framed this event. But there is the question of a currently non-functional SARC, which is currently held up. And it's a legitimate question to ask whether a buoyant Bangladesh-Pakistan relationship can, going ahead, make a difference to making SARC more active, if for nothing else then for trade negotiations, because we've seen what ASEAN has achieved, which SARC, simply because it doesn't, hasn't been functional, has failed to achieve. So, but Alexander, if you would like to say anything about what you think India-Bangladesh rapprochement may look like post-Feb, and Bangladesh-Pakistan relations post-Feb, and SARC.
Nilanjan, thanks very much. I think on SARC, I'll restrict myself to saying the very obvious. SARC is not ASEAN. And don't hold your breath. If it could become ASEAN, great. I'm not expecting to see that anytime very soon. Look, I don't claim to be a deep expert on Bangladesh, but I would say when I was last in Pakistan in April, I think that for Pakistan, I think there is a real perception of an opportunity here for the government, for the army, and an aspiration to do more with Bangladesh, and to do more in that relationship with Bangladesh vis-a-vis India. I don't necessarily think that will be the same perspective, and I would echo other members of the panel on from a Dhaka perspective. I think a more measured, a policy that bets a bit more on optionality is more likely to be in play. So Pakistan, it's maximum sifarish, maximum influence, maximum recommendation. The really interesting question is the India question. And actually, I think for Prime Minister Modi, for Ajit Doval, the National Security Advisor, for Dr. Jaishankar, India's Foreign Minister, the challenging question will be, Bangladesh is a really important neighbour. It matters to India. And what position does India then take if we see, for example, a BNP government next? I would close simply by saying, my hope would be that we end up back in a space with proper multi-party elections across South Asia, because guess what? Elections may not be perfect, but they do allow you to kick out governments you don't like very much. And that still seems to me far better than the alternative. But Nilanjan, thank you very much for having us all along.
Thank you very much. This has been wonderful and as expected, very, very interesting, engaging and animated in its own way. For those of you who watch our events regularly or have watched even a single one in the last 5 years, you would know that I end every event by saying that if there's anything good that came out of the COVID pandemic, it's just that we all became tech savvy and learned how to use Zoom, and that allows me to convene these absolutely wonderful panel discussions. Having said that, we couldn't have done any of this if our panelists, if Alexander, who's my colleague and has agreed to be discussing this afternoon, do not give freely of their time. All of you are very busy, so we are very grateful both for your time and for your expertise. Ayesha Siddiqa, Zafar Sobhan, Lisa Curtis, and Alexander Evans. Thank you, everyone, and good evening.